The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Mitchells' modern suburban mansion, casting a warm glow over the sleek, minimalist interior. Jason Mitchell stood in the kitchen, absently stirring his coffee as he reviewed the day's agenda on his tablet. He was a man in his late 30s, with a sharp mind and an eye for detail qualities that had served him well in building his luxury car dealership into one of the most successful in the region. Tall and lean, with just a hint of gray at his temples, he cut an imposing figure, though his demeanor was always calm, almost calculated. The house was quiet this morning, as it often was these days. Elena Mitchell, his wife of 10 years, was at the gym, or so she had said when she left earlier. The once vivacious spark in their marriage had dimmed over the past few years, and while Jason had noticed, he attributed it to the natural ebb and flow of long-term relationships. They were both busy professionals, after all. He with his dealership, which demanded long hours and constant attention, and Elena with her fitness studio, which she had built from the ground up after leaving her modeling career. Elena had been a force of nature when they first met, a former model with a magnetic personality and a beauty that turned heads wherever she went. Jason had been captivated by her from the start, drawn to her confidence and the way she seemed to light up every room she entered. They had been the perfect power couple, admired by friends and envied by others. But as the years passed, Jason had become more engrossed in his work, driven by a relentless desire to expand his business. Elena, on the other hand, had shifted her focus to her studio, channeling her energy into helping others achieve their fitness goals. Despite their separate pursuits, they had always managed to maintain a comfortable rhythm in their marriage. They had a beautiful home, financial security, and a lifestyle that many would envy. Yet, beneath the surface, something had changed. Elena had become increasingly distant, her smiles more perfunctory, her touch more fleeting. She was often preoccupied, her mind seemingly elsewhere, even during their rare moments together. Jason took a sip of his coffee, his thoughts wandering back to the early days of their relationship. They used to share everything: dreams, fears, and endless conversations that lasted long into the night. But now, those conversations had dwindled to mere exchanges about logistics and schedules. The spark that had once defined their relationship had been replaced by a routine that felt more like cohabitation than a marriage. He glanced at his watch, noting the time. Elena would be back soon, and they would have their usual hurried breakfast before he headed to the dealership and she to her studio. This was their life now, a series of parallel tracks that rarely intersected. But lately something had been gnawing at him, a vague sense of unease that he couldn't quite pinpoint. It was as if a shadow had crept into their marriage, one that he couldn't identify but could no longer ignore. There were the small things: Elena's sudden need for privacy, the late-night texts she claimed were from clients, and the unexplained expenses that had started appearing on their credit card statements. Jason had always trusted Elena implicitly, never doubting her loyalty. But these subtle changes were starting to form a pattern that he couldn't dismiss. The sound of the front door opening jolted him from his thoughts. He turned to see Elena entering the kitchen, her gym bag slung over her shoulder. She was dressed in her usual workout gear, leggings, and a fitted tank top that showed off her toned physique. Her long, dark hair was pulled back into a high ponytail, and her face glowed with the kind of effortless beauty that had once made her a sought-after model. "Morning," she said, offering him a quick smile as she set her bag down on the counter. "How was your night?" "Good, as usual," Jason replied, his tone neutral. "Just catching up on some reading. How was the gym?" "Busy," Elena said, opening the fridge and pulling out a bottle of water. "I had a full class this morning. The new routine I put together seems to be a hit." Jason nodded, watching her closely as she moved around the kitchen. There was an air of detachment about her, as if she were going through the motions without really being present. It was something he had noticed more and more lately, a certain aloofness that made her seem distant, even when she was standing right in front of him. "Elena," he began, choosing his words carefully, "is everything okay? You've seemed different lately." Elena paused, her hand hovering over the coffee maker. She turned to face him, her expression guarded. "Different? How do you mean?" "I don't know," Jason said slowly, setting down his tablet. You've just been preoccupied. I feel like we haven't really connected in a while. Elena sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. I have just been busy, Jason. The studio is demanding, and I'm trying to keep things fresh for my clients. It's nothing more than that. Jason studied her for a moment, sensing that there was more to her words than she was letting on. But before he could press further, Elena crossed the room and placed a hand on his arm. Jason, I know I've been distant, she said softly, her eyes meeting his. But it's not because of you. I've just had a lot on my mind lately. The studio, the clients, everything. I'm sorry if it's come across as anything else. He searched her eyes, looking for anything that might reassure him, but all he saw was a tiredness that he hadn't noticed before, a weariness that seemed to have settled deep within her. It's okay, he said finally, forcing a smile. I just want us to be us again, you know? Elena smiled back, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. We will be, I promise. Let's just get through this busy period, and then maybe we can take some time off together. A vacation, just the two of us. Yeah, Jason agreed, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. That sounds like a good idea. Elena gave him a quick kiss on the cheek before turning to grab her water bottle. I'm going to take a shower before I head to the studio. I'll see you tonight. Jason nodded, watching as she left the kitchen. As he heard the sound of her footsteps retreating up the stairs, he felt a heaviness settle in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something Elena wasn't telling him, something she was hiding. And for the first time in their marriage, Jason found himself doubting her words. He picked up his tablet again, but his thoughts were far from the dealership's agenda. Instead, they were focused on Elena and the nagging suspicion that had taken root in his mind. A suspicion that, despite his best efforts to ignore, was growing stronger with each passing day. And as Jason sat there, sipping his now lukewarm coffee, he couldn't help but wonder if their marriage was as solid as he had always believed, or if it was beginning to crumble beneath the weight of secrets he was only just beginning to uncover. The days that followed that morning conversation with Elena were anything but ordinary. Jason Mitchell found himself caught in a strange web of doubt and suspicion, emotions that were foreign to him. He had always prided himself on his rationality, his ability to remain level-headed in any situation. But now, that very rationality was being challenged by the unsettling thoughts swirling in his mind. The initial signs of trouble had been easy to dismiss. Elena was busy, her studio was thriving, and she was passionate about her work. But as the days turned into weeks, Jason couldn't ignore the growing distance between them. Elena was out more often, attending business meetings and networking events that seemed to take up increasingly large portions of her time. She was constantly on her phone, typing away messages with a focus that left Jason feeling more like an outsider in his own home. One evening, as Jason sat alone in the living room, the sound of Elena's laughter drifted down from the upstairs bedroom. She was on the phone, speaking in hushed tones that were punctuated by occasional giggles. Jason tried to concentrate on the news program playing on the television, but his attention kept shifting back to Elena's laughter. It was a sound he hadn't heard in their interactions for quite some time, a light, carefree laugh that reminded him of the early days of their relationship. Unable to shake the nagging feeling, Jason quietly made his way upstairs. He stopped just outside their bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. Through the gap, he could see Elena lying on the bed, her back against the headboard, her legs crossed casually at the ankles. Her phone was pressed to her ear and she was smiling a genuine, warm smile that Jason hadn't seen in weeks. I can believe you remember that, she said, her voice soft and teasing. That was so long ago, but yeah, it was a fun time. There was a pause as the person on the other end of the line responded. Jason couldn't make out the words, but whatever was said made Elena's smile widen. Oh, you are terrible, she said, laughing again. But you are right. It was worth it. Maybe we'll have to do it again sometime. Jason felt a cold knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. He stood frozen in place, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the conversation. Who was she talking to? What were they reminiscing about? His heart pounded in his chest as he considered the possibilities, each one more troubling than the last. Before he could decide what to do, Elena glanced toward the door and saw him standing there. Her smile faltered for a split second, but she quickly recovered, waving at him with a cheerful expression. "Hey, babe," she called out, her tone light. "Just talking to an old friend. I'll be down in a minute, okay?" Jason nodded stiffly, forcing a smile in return. "Sure, take your time." He turned and headed back downstairs, his thoughts spinning out of control. There was something in Elena's demeanor that didn't sit right with him, something too casual, too practiced. And that sudden shift in her expression when she saw him, had it been guilt? Or was he just imagining things? Back in the living room, Jason sank onto the couch, his mind still reeling. He knew he couldn't let this go. He needed to find out what was really going on, but how? Elena had always been so careful, so meticulous about keeping her personal and professional lives separate. It wasn't like her to leave clues lying around. But then, Jason remembered something. Elena had always been protective of her phone, more so in recent months. She never left it unattended, and she had even changed the password recently, a move that had struck Jason as odd at the time. What if the answers he was looking for were on that phone? The idea of invading her privacy made him uneasy, but the more he thought about it, the more he convinced himself that he had no other choice. If Elena was hiding something from him, he needed to know. He couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. Later that night, after Elena had fallen asleep, Jason lay awake beside her, listening to the sound of her breathing. His mind was racing, and sleep was the last thing on his mind. Instead, he was focused on the phone that lay on the nightstand next to Elena's side of the bed. It was close, so close that he could almost reach out and take it. But what if she woke up? What if she caught him snooping through her messages? The thought of her reaction made his pulse quicken. Couldn't he risk it? Not yet. He needed a better plan. The next day, as Jason was getting ready for work, he noticed that Elena had left her phone on the kitchen counter. It was an unusual lapse. She always had it with her, especially when she was heading out. But today, it sat there, unguarded, as she grabbed her gym bag and kissed him goodbye. "I'll be back late tonight," she said, flashing him a quick smile. "I've got a dinner meeting with some potential new clients. Dawn to wait up, okay?" "Sure," Jason replied, his voice even. "Have a good day." As soon as the door closed behind her, Jason's eyes locked onto the phone. This was his chance. He grabbed it quickly, his hands trembling slightly as he swiped the screen. To his relief, the phone hadn't locked, yet Elena must have been in a hurry and hadn't bothered to secure it. Taking a deep breath, Jason navigated to her messages, his heart pounding in his chest. What he found there made his blood run cold. There were dozens of messages from a number he didn't recognize, all under the name V. The texts were flirtatious, filled with inside jokes and references to things that Jason had no knowledge of. But it was the photos that really drove the point-home selfies of Elena in suggestive poses, some taken in the very bedroom where Jason now stood, as well as pictures of expensive gifts, a bracelet, a handbag that Jason knew he hadn't bought for her. His vision blurred with anger and disbelief as he scrolled through the messages. The texts were explicit, leaving no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Jason's hands shook as he read the exchanges, each one feeling like a knife twisting deeper into his gut. "Had an amazing time last night," one message from V read. "Can't wait to see you again. Same place next week." Another text from Elena. "You always know how to make me smile. I'll be there. Dawn to keep me waiting." Jason's breathing grew ragged as he realized the full extent of what he had uncovered. His wife, his Elena, was having an affair. And not just any affair, but one that was clearly planned and premeditated, with meetings at fancy hotels and gifts that spoke of a man with money and power. This wasn't a fling, it was a full-blown relationship, and Elena had been hiding it from him for who knows how long. Numbly, Jason set the phone back on the counter, his mind spinning. He felt like he was in a nightmare, one that he couldn't wake up from. The life he had built, the woman he had loved and trusted, all of it had been a lie. The realization hit him with a force that left him breathless, his chest tightening with a mixture of pain, anger, and betrayal. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at the phone as if it were some kind of alien object. He had never felt so lost, so utterly helpless in his own life. What was he supposed to do now? Confront her? Demand answers? Or should he just walk away, cut his losses, and start over? But as the initial shock began to wear off, something else started to take its place, a cold, calculated resolve. Jason Mitchell was not a man who would allow himself to be played for a fool. If Elena thought she could betray him and get away with it, she was sorely mistaken. He knew what he had to do, but it wouldn't be rushed. No, this would take time. He would gather more evidence, more information, and when the time was right, he would confront her with everything. He would expose her lies, her deceit, and ensure that she paid for every single betrayal. As Jason stood there, his mind racing with plans and possibilities, he realized that this was just the beginning. The discovery of Elena's affair had shattered the illusion of their perfect marriage, but it had also awakened something in him, something cold, ruthless, and determined. He would not let this break him. Instead, he would use it to fuel his next steps, to take control of the situation and ensure that when the dust settled, it was he who came out on top. And as he made his way to his car, heading to the dealership as if it were just another day, Jason couldn't help but feel a grim sense of satisfaction. The game had changed, and he was no longer the unwitting player. Now, it was time for him to rewrite the rules. The evening sky was painted in hues of deep orange and violet as Jason Mitchell sat at the dining room table, his thoughts miles away from the untouched dinner in front of him. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that weighed heavily on his chest. He could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock, each second echoing in the stillness, amplifying the tension that had been building up inside him all day. He knew it was only a matter of time before Elena returned home. She had texted earlier, a brief message saying she would be late due to a business dinner, the same excuse she had been using more frequently over the past few weeks. But tonight, Jason knew the truth. He knew exactly where she had been and with whom. He had spent the entire day in a state of controlled rage, meticulously planning how he would confront her. The evidence he had uncovered on her phone was damning, and there was no room for denial or excuses. But as much as he wanted to lash out, to demand answers, he knew he had to keep his emotions in check. This confrontation needed to be carefully handled, strategic, just like any business deal he had ever orchestrated. He needed to hear her out, to understand the full extent of her betrayal before he made his move. The sound of the front door opening snapped him out of his thoughts. His heart pounded in his chest as he heard Elena's footsteps echo through the hallway, growing closer with each step. He could picture her perfectly calm, composed, and utterly unaware of the storm that was about to hit. When she finally entered the dining room, Jason forced himself to remain seated, to maintain an air of nonchalance despite the turmoil brewing inside him. Elena appeared in the doorway, dressed elegantly in a deep blue dress that hugged her curves, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She looked every bit the sophisticated businesswoman she claimed to be. And for a moment, Jason felt a pang of something lost, perhaps, for the woman he thought he knew. "Hey," Elena greeted him with a warm smile, though there was a hint of surprise in her eyes as she took in the sight of him still sitting at the table. "You're still up? I thought you'd be asleep by now." Jason didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her, noting the faint traces of a day well spent, slight creases at the corners of her eyes, the lingering scent of a luxurious perfume he didn't recognize. His silence seemed to unnerve her, and she shifted on her feet, her smile faltering. "Jason?" she prompted, a touch of concern in her voice. "Is everything okay?" He finally met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I waited up for you," he said evenly, his voice betraying none of the emotions churning beneath the surface. Elena's brow furrowed slightly as she took a step closer, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "Is something wrong? You're not usually this quiet." He let out a slow breath, leaning back in his chair as he regarded her with a mixture of frustration and sadness. "Elena, we need to talk." The shift in her demeanor was subtle, but Jason caught it. Her eyes flickered with a flash of unease, and she seemed to hesitate before taking another step forward. "About what?" she asked, though her voice had lost some of its earlier warmth. Jason's gaze never wavered. "About us. About what's been going on between us lately. And about what I found on your phone." The color drained from Elena's face in an instant, her confident posture wilting as she realized the gravity of the situation. "My phone?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "What? What do you mean?" He stood up slowly, pushing his chair back with deliberate calmness. The tension in the room was palpable, like the quiet before a storm. "You know exactly what I mean, Elena," he said, his tone icy. "The messages, the photos, the late-night conversations with someone who isn't your business client." For a moment, Elena looked as if she might faint. Her eyes widened with shock, and her hand flew to her mouth as she struggled to find words. "Jason, I can explain." Jason cut her off, his voice rising with the intensity he had been holding back all day. "You think you can explain away months of lies and betrayal? I found everything, Elena. I know about V. I know about the hotels, the gifts, the time you spent with him when you were supposed to be with me." Elena's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head as if trying to deny the reality that had finally caught up with her. "Jason, please let me—" "Let you what?" Jason interrupted, his anger bubbling over. "Let you lie to me some more? Let you spin some story about how it wasn't what it looked like? Because from where I am standing, it looks exactly like what it is, a betrayal of everything we built together." The room was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of Elena's shaky breathing. She seemed to shrink before him, her earlier poise shattered as she finally broke down into tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Jason, I am so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. Jason S.S." Expression hardened, his jaw clenched as he struggled to keep his emotions in check. "You didn't just hurt me, Elena. You destroyed the trust we had. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Elena's tears flowed freely now, streaking her makeup as she tried to reach out to him. "Jason, please listen to me. I was lonely. You were always working, always away, and I felt invisible. I never planned for this to happen. It just did." "Don't you dare put this on me," Jason snapped, pulling away from her outstretched hand. "Yes, I was working. I was working to provide for us, to give you everything you ever wanted. And this is how you repay me?" Elena's sobs grew louder, her shoulders shaking as she crumpled into a nearby chair. "I know I've made a terrible mistake," she cried. "But I still love you, Jason. I never stopped loving you." Jason's heart ached at her words, but he refused to let himself be swayed by her tears. "Love?" he repeated, his voice bitter. "You call this love? Sneaking around behind my back, lying to my face every single day? That's not love, Elena. That is selfishness. That's betrayal." Elena buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled by her fingers. "I didn't want it to be like this," she whispered. "I didn't want to lose you." Jason clenched his fists, his anger and pain warring within him. He had so many questions, so many things he wanted to say, but the sight of Elena breaking down in front of him left him feeling drained, exhausted by the weight of it all. "Why, Elena?" he asked quietly, his voice filled with a mix of sadness and disbelief. "Why did you do it? Was I really that bad of a husband?" She shook her head vehemently, her voice breaking as she tried to explain. "No, Jason. You weren't T. You were always good to me. Too good. But I felt lost. I felt like I didn't matter anymore. And Victor, he made me feel alive again, like I was someone special. But it wasn't real. It was just a fantasy. I was so stupid to think it meant anything." The mention of Victor's name sent a fresh wave of anger through Jason. "Victor!" he spat, the name tasting like poison on his tongue. "So that is his name, the man who was worth more to you than our marriage." Elena winced at the venom in his voice, her tears falling faster. "No, Jason, he wasn't worth it. None of this was worth it. I know that now. But please, please don't let this be the end of us. I'll do anything to make it right. Just give me a chance." Jason stared at her, his emotions a tangled mess of love, anger, and despair. The woman before him was both the person he had loved more than anything, and a stranger who had shattered his world. He wanted to believe her, to hold on to the hope that they could somehow salvage what was left of their relationship. But the wounds were too deep, the betrayal too fresh. "I don't know if I can do that," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Elena's sobs turned into desperate pleas, her voice cracking with emotion. "Please, Jason, I'll do anything. I'll go to therapy. I'll cut all ties with Victor. I'll never see him again. Just please don't leave me. I can bear to lose you." Jason felt a lump rise in his throat as he looked at her, so broken and vulnerable. Part of him wanted to reach out, to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay. But he knew that would be a lie. Nothing about this was okay, and he wasn't sure it ever would be. "I need time," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to think." Elena nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "Take all the time you need," she said quietly. "I'll be here waiting. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Jason didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Elena alone with her tears and regrets. As he made his way up the stairs to the guest bedroom, he felt as though a part of him had been ripped away, leaving behind a hollow, aching void. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, his mind racing with everything that had just transpired. The confrontation had been brutal, far more emotional than he had anticipated. But now that it was over, he was left with more questions than answers. Could he ever forgive Elena for what she had done? Could he ever trust her again? And if not, what did that mean for their marriage, for the life they had built together? Jason collapsed onto the bed, his body heavy with exhaustion. As he lay there, staring up at the ceiling, he realized that the hardest part of this journey was only just beginning. The discovery of Elena's affair had been devastating, but the path forward was even more uncertain. And as the night stretched on, with only the darkness to keep him company, Jason knew that he was standing at a crossroads. The decisions he made in the coming days would determine the future of his marriage, his life, and everything he had once held dear. But for now, all he could do was close his eyes and try to block out the pain, the anger, and the sense of betrayal that threatened to consume him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make, and whatever path he chose, there would be no turning back. Jason Mitchell lay awake in the guest bedroom, the first rays of dawn filtering through the blinds. The night had been long and torturous, his mind trapped in an endless loop of questions and memories. Sleep had eluded him, as every time he closed his eyes, he was haunted by the images of Elena's betrayal, her words, her tears, and the undeniable truth of what she had done. The life they had built together now felt like a fragile illusion, shattered beyond repair. He finally rose from the bed, his body stiff and aching from the lack of rest. As he stood in front of the mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back at him. His eyes were bloodshot, dark circles under them, his face drawn and weary. It was as if the man who had confidently led his business empire had been replaced by someone broken, uncertain of what lay ahead. Jason headed downstairs, the house eerily quiet in the early morning light. He moved through the motions of making coffee, but the smell of it did little to lift the fog that had settled over him. His thoughts were consumed by what Elena had said the night before, her claims of loneliness, her pleas for forgiveness. Part of him wanted to believe her, to cling to the idea that their marriage could somehow be salvaged. But another part, the part that had been ruthlessly betrayed, screamed that he would never be able to trust her again. He sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the mug in front of him. The silence around him was deafening, the emptiness of the house a stark contrast to the chaos in his mind. His thoughts drifted back to the early days of their relationship, when everything had seemed so simple, so full of promise. They had been in love truly, deeply in love. What had happened to that love? Where had it gone? Jason had always prided himself on being a strong man, someone who could handle anything life threw at him. But this was different. This was a betrayal of the deepest kind, one that cut to the very core of who he was. He had trusted Elena implicitly, had built his life around the belief that they were a team, partners in everything, and now that belief had been shattered. The sound of footsteps on the stairs brought him out of his reverie. He looked up to see Elena descending slowly, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen from a night of crying. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, as if unsure whether to approach him or retreat back to the bedroom. The hesitation in her eyes spoke volumes. She was as lost as he was, unsure of where they stood, or if there was any way forward. "Morning," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. Jason didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at her, trying to reconcile the woman he had loved with the one who had lied to him so effortlessly. Finally he nodded, his expression unreadable. "Morning." Elena bit her lip, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, though the question seemed more out of habit than genuine concern. "No," Jason replied, his tone flat. "Did you?" She shook her head, her hands wringing nervously. "I couldn't. I just kept thinking about everything. About us." Jason nodded, though her words did little to ease the ache in his chest. "I have been doing a lot of thinking too," he said, his voice steady, but with an undercurrent of weariness. Elena hesitated before walking slowly into the kitchen. She pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, her movements careful, almost tentative. She looked like a shadow of the woman he had known, fragile, almost broken. Jason wasn't sure if it made him feel pity or anger. "I know I hurt you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "and I know saying sorry isn't enough. But Jason, I meant what I said last night. I still love you. I never stopped loving you. I just made a terrible mistake." Jason's grip tightened around his coffee mug, the tension in his body building with every word she spoke. "A mistake?" he echoed, his voice laced with bitterness. "Is that what you're calling it? Sneaking around, lying to my face, betraying everything we have built together, that this is just a mistake to you?" Elena flinched at the sharpness of his tone, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know how else to describe it," she said, her voice breaking. "It was wrong, Jason. I know it was wrong, but I didn't know how to stop. I felt so lost, and Victor made me feel like I mattered again. But it was all a lie. I see that now." Jason shook his head, his frustration boiling over. "And what about me, Elena? Did you think about me at all while you were with him? Did you think about what this would do to our marriage, to the life we've built?" She looked down at her hands, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "I was selfish," she admitted, her voice choked with emotion. "I let my own insecurities, my own needs, blind me to what I was doing to you. I was wrong, Jason. I was so wrong." Jason leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair as he tried to process everything she was saying. It was hard to reconcile the woman before him, filled with regret and sorrow, with the one who had been so deceitful, so calculating. He wanted to believe that she was truly sorry, that she understood the magnitude of her actions. But the pain of her betrayal was too raw, too overwhelming. "Why didn't you talk to me?" he asked, his voice heavy with sadness. "If you were feeling lost, if you needed something more, why didn't you come to me?" Elena looked up, her eyes filled with guilt. "I tried," she whispered. "But every time I started to say something, you were so focused on work, on the dealership. I felt like I was invisible, like I didn't matter anymore. And I know that's not an excuse, but it's the truth. I didn't know how to reach you, so I stopped trying." Jason felt a pang of guilt at her words, a tiny crack forming in the wall of anger he had built around himself. He had been consumed by his work, by his desire to provide for them, to secure their future. But had he really been so blind to Elena's needs? Had he been so focused on his own goals that he had missed the signs that something was wrong? "You should have kept trying," Jason said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "You should have fought for us, instead of turning to someone else." "I know," Elena replied, her tears flowing freely now. "I know, Jason. I failed you. I failed us. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right, if you'll let me." Jason looked at her, his heart torn between the love he had once felt for her and the anger that now consumed him. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the desperation in her voice. But trust, once broken, was not easily repaired, and the wounds she had inflicted on him were deep, too deep to simply be healed by apologies and promises. "I don't know if I can do that," he said finally, his voice cracking with emotion. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again, knowing what you've done." Elena's face crumpled, her tears falling faster as she reached out to him, her hand trembling. "Jason, please," she begged, her voice raw with desperation. "Don't give up on us. We can get through this. We can rebuild what we had. I'll do whatever it takes, I swear." But Jason couldn't bring himself to take her hand. The pain was too fresh, the betrayal too deep. He shook his head slowly, his chest tightening as he tried to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. "I need time," he said again, his voice barely audible. "I need to figure out what I want, what we're going to do. But right now, I can't give you any answers." Elena nodded, though her expression was one of utter defeat. She wiped at her tears, her hands shaking as she tried to compose herself. "I understand," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here waiting, hoping that you'll find a way to forgive me." Jason didn't respond. He couldn't bring himself to make any promises, not when he wasn't sure what the future held for them. Instead, he stood up from the table, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. "I need to get out of here," he said, his voice tight. "I need some space to think." Elena looked up at him, her eyes pleading, but she didn't try to stop him. She simply nodded, her tears still falling as she watched him turn and walk away. Jason grabbed his keys from the counter and headed for the door, the sound of Elena's quiet sobs echoing in his ears. He didn't look back as he stepped outside, the cool morning air hitting his face like a splash of cold water. He needed to clear his head, to get away from the house, from the memories that haunted him at every turn. He got into his car and started the engine, the familiar hum of the vehicle doing little to soothe the turmoil inside him. As he drove through the quiet streets, his mind raced with everything that had been said, everything that had been revealed. The emotions he had been holding back all night now threatened to overwhelm him: anger, sadness, confusion, guilt. He drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, his thoughts a chaotic jumble. He couldn't go to work, not like this. He wasn't ready to face anyone, to put on a mask and pretend that everything was okay. He needed to be alone, to process what had happened, to figure out what his next move would be. Eventually, Jason found himself pulling into the parking lot of a secluded park on the outskirts of town. The place was nearly deserted, the early hour ensuring that he would have the space to himself. He parked the car and got out, the crisp morning air doing little to calm the storm raging inside him. He walked along a narrow path that wound through the trees, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath him. The park was peaceful, serene, a stark contrast to the turmoil in his heart. He found a bench overlooking a small pond and sat down, his gaze fixed on the still water. For a long time, Jason just sat there, letting the silence wash over him. His mind replayed the events of the past few days, the confrontation with Elena, the pain in her eyes, the tears she had shed. He had never felt so conflicted, so torn between his love for her and the betrayal that had shattered their marriage. He had always been a man of action, someone who made decisions quickly and decisively, but now he felt paralyzed, unsure of what the right path was. Could he ever forgive Elena? Could he ever look at her without seeing the lies, the deceit? Or was this the end of their marriage, the end of the life they had built together? The thought of losing her, of losing the future they had planned, was almost too much to bear. But the thought of staying, of trying to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of broken trust, was equally daunting. Jason buried his face in his hands, his emotions finally spilling over as he let out a choked sob. He had never felt so lost, so helpless. The man who had built an empire, who had faced countless challenges in his life, now found himself at a crossroads with no clear direction. He knew that whatever decision he made, it would change everything. There was no going back, no undoing what had been done, and the weight of that realization was almost suffocating. But as he sat there, the tears streaming down his face, Jason knew one thing for certain: he couldn't make this decision alone. He needed help, needed someone to talk to, someone who could help him see through the fog of pain and confusion. And in that moment, he realized there was only one person he could turn to: his best friend, James Thornton. James had been there for him through everything, the ups and downs of life, the successes and the failures. He was the one person Jason trusted implicitly, the one person who would give him honest, unfiltered advice. If anyone could help him make sense of this mess, it was James. Wiping his tears away, Jason pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. His finger hovered over James's name for a moment before he finally pressed it, the call connecting after only a few rings. "Hey, man," James's voice came through the line, warm and familiar. "What's up? You okay?" Jason took a deep breath, his voice trembling as he replied, "James, I need to talk. Can you meet me somewhere?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Jason could almost picture the concern on James's face. "Of course," James said, his tone serious. "Where are you? I'll be there as soon as I can." Jason gave him the location of the park, his voice wavering as he tried to keep his emotions in check. "Thanks, James. I really appreciate it." "Don't mention it," James replied, his voice filled with reassurance. "I'll be there soon. Hang in there, okay?" Jason ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his hands still trembling slightly. He knew he was doing the right thing by reaching out to James, but the uncertainty of what lay ahead still weighed heavily on him. As he waited for his friend to arrive, Jason tried to steady his breathing, to calm the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to pull him under. He didn't know what he would say to James, or how he would explain everything that had happened, but he knew that talking to someone, getting an outside perspective, was the first step toward finding clarity. And so he sat there, alone with his thoughts, the cool breeze rustling the leaves around him, as he waited for the one person he knew he could count on in his darkest hour. The park was still quiet, the morning slowly giving way to the soft light of a cloudy day. Jason Mitchell sat on the bench, his gaze lost in the gentle ripples of the pond, though his thoughts were far from serene. The conversation he had just endured with Elena played on a loop in his mind, each word a reminder of the reality he was now forced to confront. He couldn't shake the image of her tear-streaked face, her voice trembling with regret as she begged for forgiveness. But no matter how much he tried, he couldn't silence the echo of her betrayal. He had no idea how much time had passed when he finally heard the crunch of gravel underfoot, followed by the familiar voice of James Thornton calling out to him. "Jason," James said as he approached, his tone heavy with concern. "What's going on, man? You sounded pretty shaken up on the phone." Jason looked up, meeting his best friend's eyes for the first time since everything had fallen apart. James was a few years older than him, with a rugged, dependable demeanor that had seen them both through countless challenges over the years. His sharp blue eyes were filled with worry as he took in Jason's appearance, disheveled, exhausted, a man clearly on the edge. "James," Jason greeted him, his voice rough from the emotions that had choked him earlier. "Thanks for coming." James sat down beside him on the bench, his expression serious. "You know I'd drop everything for you, Jason, but you were scaring me here. What happened?" Jason hesitated, the weight of what he was about to say pressing down on him. He had always been a private person, someone who kept his personal struggles close to the chest. But this was too big to carry alone. "I found out something," Jason began slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something about Elena, something that changed everything." James remained silent, his gaze never leaving Jason's face. He could see that whatever it was, it had hit Jason harder than anything he had ever seen before. He didn't push for details, knowing that Jason would speak when he was ready. After a long pause, Jason finally continued, his words laced with pain. "She's been having an affair, James, for months, maybe longer. I found out a couple of days ago. I confronted her last night and she admitted to everything." James's eyes widened slightly in shock, though he quickly masked his reaction with a calm, supportive demeanor. "Jason, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice filled with empathy. "I can even imagine what you're going through right now." Jason nodded, though his expression remained distant, as if he were still processing the reality of the situation. "It is like my whole world has been turned upside down," he said quietly. "I never saw it coming. I thought we were okay, that we were just going through a rough patch like any couple. But this is something else entirely." James leaned back on the bench, his brow furrowed in thought. He had seen Jason go through tough times before, but this was different. This wasn't just a setback at work or a difficult decision about the business. This was personal, deeply personal, and it was clear that Jason was struggling to find his footing. "Did she say why?" James asked cautiously. "I mean, was there something that led her to this?" Jason let out a bitter laugh, the sound devoid of any real humor. "She said she was lonely, that I was too focused on work, on providing for us, and that she felt invisible. So she turned to someone else, someone who made her feel alive again." James shook his head, his expression hardening. "That's no excuse," he said firmly. "You were doing what you thought was best for both of you, for your future. If she had a problem with that, she should have talked to you, not gone behind your back." "I know," Jason agreed, his voice filled with frustration. "I know that. But hearing her say it, it's like a punch to the gut. I keep wondering if I could have done something differently, if I could have seen the signs sooner. But then I think, does it even matter? She made her choice. She betrayed me. That's the bottom line." James nodded slowly, understanding the internal battle Jason was waging. "So what are you going to do?" he asked, though he suspected that Jason was still far from making a decision. Jason sighed, his gaze drifting back to the pond. "I don't know, James, I really don't know. Part of me wants to just walk away, to cut my losses and start over. But the other part of me, the part that still loves her, it's telling me to try to see if we can somehow fix this. But how do you fix something like this? How do you ever trust someone again after they've broken your heart?" James was silent for a moment, carefully considering his words. "Jason, I cannot tell you what to do," he said finally. "But I can tell you this, whatever decision you make, it has to be the one that's right for you. Not for Elena, not for anyone else, but for you. You deserve to be happy, to have a life where you're not constantly looking over your shoulder, wondering if you're going to get hurt again." Jason nodded, though his expression remained conflicted. "But what if I can let go? What if I'm too afraid to start over?" "Then you take it one day at a time," James replied gently. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. You just need to give yourself the space to figure out what you really want. And whatever that is, I'll be here to support you, no matter what." Jason looked at his friend, gratitude welling up inside him. He had always known that James was someone he could count on, but hearing those words now in his darkest hour meant more to him than he could express. "Thank you, James," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You don't have to do anything without me," James replied with a small smile. "That's what friends are for, right?" Jason managed a faint smile in return, though the weight of the situation still hung heavily on him. "Yeah," he said quietly, "that is what friends are for." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the sound of the breeze rustling the leaves providing a soothing backdrop to their thoughts. Jason found some comfort in James's presence, the steady, reliable support he offered without judgment or pressure. Eventually, James broke the silence, his tone thoughtful. "You know, Jason, if you do decide to try and work things out with Elena, you're going to need help. Professional help. This isn't something you can fix on your own." Jason nodded, knowing James was right. "Yeah, I've been thinking about that. If I decide to give it a shot, we'll need counseling. I don't see any other way." "It is a good start," James agreed. "But remember, counseling isn't a magic fix. It is going to be a long, hard road, and you'll both have to be committed to it. And even then, it might not work out. But if you are willing to try, then that's all anyone can ask." Jason sighed, the enormity of the situation weighing on him. "I don't even know if I want to try," he admitted. "I mean, How do you go back to being with someone after they've broken your heart? How do you look at them and not see the person who betrayed you? James was quiet for a moment, his expression pensive. I don't know, Jason, he said finally. I don't have the answers to that. But I do know that forgiveness isn't something that happens overnight. It is a process, and it takes time, a lot of time. And even then, you might not ever fully forgive her. But if you love her, and if she's truly sorry, then maybe, just maybe, it's worth trying. Jason didn't respond immediately. He stared out at the pond, the ripples on the water mirroring the turmoil in his heart. He had never felt so lost, so uncertain of what the future held. But he knew that whatever decision he made, it would have far-reaching consequences, not just for him, but for Elena as well. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice filled with quiet resolve. I need to talk to her again. I need to really understand why she did this, and whether she is truly committed to making things right. I can't make any decisions until I have all the facts. James nodded, his expression supportive. That sounds like a good plan. Take your time, Jason. Don't rush into anything. This is your life, your future. You deserve to make the right choice for you. Jason looked at his friend, feeling a sense of clarity slowly beginning to form in his mind. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he was starting to see a path forward, however uncertain it might be. Thanks, James, he said sincerely. I really appreciate you being here. I don't know what I'd do without your support. You don't have to thank me, James replied with a smile. Just take care of yourself, okay? Whatever happens, you've got people who care about you. Don't forget that. Jason nodded, a small spark of hope igniting in his chest. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with pain and uncertainty, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had people in his life who cared about him, who would stand by him no matter what. As they stood up from the bench, ready to leave the park, Jason felt a sense of determination settle over him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that he would face it head on, with the same strength and resolve that had seen him through so many challenges before. Let's get out of here, Jason said, his voice stronger now, more sure of himself. I've got a lot to think about, but I know one thing: I am not going to let this break me, no matter what happens. James clapped him on the back, his smile warm and reassuring. That is the spirit, man. Whatever you decide, I am with you all the way. Together, they walked back to their cars, the weight on Jason S.'s shoulders feeling just a little bit lighter. He knew the journey ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that somehow he would find a way through this, one way or another. As they parted ways, Jason felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he was going to take control of his life again, on his terms. And whatever decision he made, he would face it with the strength and determination that had always defined him. And with that resolve, Jason headed home, ready to confront the challenges that awaited him, determined to find a way forward no matter what. Jason Mitchell drove home in a contemplative silence, his thoughts a whirl of emotions. The conversation with James had provided some much-needed clarity, but it had also reinforced the daunting reality he faced. There was no easy solution, no quick fix to the pain and betrayal that had upended his life. He was standing at a crossroads, and whichever path he chose would shape the rest of his life. As he pulled into the driveway of his once peaceful home, the sight of it stirred a fresh wave of sadness. The house that had been a symbol of their success and happiness now felt tainted, a reminder of the lies and secrets that had festered within its walls. He sat in the car for a moment, staring at the front door, trying to summon the strength to walk inside and face the woman who had turned his world upside down. The door creaked open as he stepped inside, the house eerily quiet, except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Jason closed the door behind him, taking a deep breath as he prepared himself for what was to come. Elena was nowhere in sight, but he could sense her presence, a heavy tension in the air that had replaced the warmth and love that had once filled their home. He found her in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket draped over her shoulders. She looked up as he entered, her eyes red and swollen from crying, her face pale and drawn. There was a nervous energy about her, a sense of dread that mirrored his own. "Jason," she said quietly, her voice trembling as she spoke, "I didn't know if you were coming back." Jason took a moment to gather his thoughts, his heart heavy with the weight of the conversation that lay ahead. "I needed some time to think," he replied, his tone even. "But we need to talk. We can keep avoiding this." Elena nodded, sitting up a little straighter as she prepared herself for what was to come. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've been thinking too. About everything. About us." Jason walked over to the armchair across from the couch and sat down, the distance between them feeling both physical and emotional. He studied her for a moment, trying to find the right words, but the pain and confusion in his heart made it difficult. "Elena," he began slowly, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't even know where to start. What you did. It broke something in me, something I'm not sure can ever be fixed." Elena's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out as if to close the gap between them, but stopped herself short. "I know, Jason," she said, her voice choked with sorrow. "I know I've hurt you in ways I can never take back. And I don't expect you to forgive me right away, if ever. But I need you to know that I am truly, deeply sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I never wanted this to happen." Jason clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he tried to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "But it did happen, Elena," he said, his voice raw with pain. "You made a choice. You chose to be with someone else, to betray everything we had. How am I supposed to just move past that?" Elena's tears spilled over, her body trembling as she struggled to find her voice. "I don't know, Jason," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. I want to do whatever it takes to make things right between us. I'll go to counseling. I'll cut all ties with Victor. I'll do anything you ask. Just please, don't give up on us." Jason looked at her, his heart torn between the love he still felt for her and the overwhelming sense of betrayal that had shattered their marriage. He wanted to believe her, to believe that they could somehow rebuild what had been lost. But the doubt lingered, a constant reminder that trust, once broken, was not easily restored. "I don't know if that is enough, Elena," he said quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again. And without trust, what do we have?" Elena's sobs grew louder, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in her hands. "Please, Jason," she begged, her voice muffled by her tears. "I'll do anything. Just tell me what to do. I can lose you. I can lose us." Jason's heart ached at the sight of her so broken, so desperate. He had never seen her like this before, and it pained him to know that the woman he had loved for so long was now a stranger, someone he could no longer rely on, someone who had hurt him in ways he never thought possible. But despite the pain, despite the anger and betrayal, he couldn't deny the part of him that still loved her, the part that wanted to believe that they could somehow find a way back to each other. It was that small glimmer of hope that made him speak the words that came next. "Elena," he said softly, his voice trembling, "if we're going to have any chance of moving forward, we need to be honest with each other. Completely honest. No more lies. No more secrets. If you are truly committed to making this work, then you need to be prepared to do whatever it takes. But I need you to understand that this isn't going to be easy. It is going to be painful, and it is going to take time, a lot of time." Elena lifted her head, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. "I'm ready, Jason," she said, her voice firm despite her tears. "I'll do whatever it takes. I promise you I'll never betray you again. I'll never make the same mistake again." Jason nodded slowly, though his expression remained solemn. "Then we'll start with counseling," he said, his tone resolute. "We need professional help if we're going to have any chance of repairing this, and we'll take it one day at a time, no promises, no guarantees, we'll just see where it takes us." Elena wiped her tears away, a shaky smile forming on her lips. "Thank you, Jason," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for giving us a chance. I won to let you down." Jason didn't respond immediately. his mind still reeling from the enormity of the decision he had just made. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that there were no guarantees of success, but he also knew that he wasn't ready to give up on their marriage. Not yet. There was still love there, buried beneath the pain and betrayal, and he owed it to himself to at least try. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Jason said finally, his tone measured. "This isn't going to be easy, Elena. There's a lot we need to work through, and it is going to take time. But I am willing to try if you are." Elena nodded, her expression serious. "I am, Jason," she said, her voice steady. "I am willing to do whatever it takes." They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of their decision settling over them. It was a fragile truce, a tentative step toward healing, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. As the day wore on, they began to talk for the first time in months. They discussed the counseling they would need, the steps they would take to rebuild their trust, and the boundaries that would need to be set. It was a difficult conversation, filled with painful truths and raw emotions, but it was also a necessary one. For Jason, the hardest part was acknowledging his own role in the breakdown of their marriage. He had been so focused on his work, on providing for them, that he had neglected the emotional connection that had once been the foundation of their relationship. It wasn't an excuse for Elena's actions, but it was a realization that he couldn't ignore. By the time the evening came, they were both emotionally drained, but there was a sense of quiet determination between them. They had taken the first step on a long, uncertain journey, and though the path ahead was fraught with challenges, they were committed to facing it together. As they prepared for bed that night, there was a tentative closeness between them, a fragile connection that had been absent for far too long. They didn't hold each other, didn't share the warmth of a loving embrace, but there was a sense of understanding, of shared purpose, that provided a small measure of comfort. As Jason lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he couldn't help but wonder what the future held for them. There were still so many unanswered questions, so many unresolved emotions. But for the first time since the discovery of Elena's affair, he felt a small glimmer of hope, a belief that perhaps they could find a way through this, that they could rebuild what had been broken. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. But Jason was willing to try, to see if the love they had once shared could be salvaged, if it could withstand the trials that lay ahead. And as he finally closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling him into sleep, Jason knew that whatever happened, he would face it with strength and resolve. He would take it one day at a time, one step at a time, and he would do it on his own terms. Because in the end, that was all he could do. Thank you for listening to this story. Subscribe to my channel, put a like under the video, and write a comment about how you like this story and what stories you want to hear.